This is National Geographic Channel presents. Did the Apollo astronauts really land on the moon? This question lies at the heart of a theory born in an era of suspicion and political mistrust. Can we unlock the truth and put these conspiracy theories to rest once and for all?
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Did the Apollo moon landings really happen, or were they a carefully engineered deception? Bill Casey is often referred to as the father of the moon conspiracy theorists.
When Armstrong said that's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind, I think that the footprint that he was leaving was in Area 51, north of Las Vegas, Nevada.
Apollo 11 astronaut Edwin Buzz Aldrin was the first to follow in Neil Armstrong's historic footsteps.
I'm totally in favor of freedom of speech, but I think people need to be responsible when they think about intentionally, for their own benefit, misleading the young people who are the future leaders of our world.
Surprisingly, the source of moon conspiracy theories is a very small group of people. Yet somehow, over the last 3 decades, the ideas of a scattered few have entered the public consciousness.
And you hear about the fact that the landing was actually done in a television studio.
And there was the big black background with, like, you know, fake stars and stuff. It's the flag being planted on the moon facing one way and the shadow of the man being the other way.
I mean, I've heard that maybe the terrain that was seen on the video wasn't accurate, the walking wasn't accurate.
There are no stars in some of the photographs, and that there should be because there was no atmosphere and that the stars would shine so brightly.
But if the Apollo missions were faked, it would mean NASA had created a hoax of monumental proportions. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a struggle for global dominance. Then on October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite into orbit, a breakthrough that hit America right where it hurt, in the heart of high technology.
Sputnik shocked a lot of people in this country, and I think the president was looking for a way to respond to this, and at the advice of a number of people, he chose an objective that he felt for sure we could be first.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
But was putting a man on the moon so important that the United States government faked it? If so, legions of NASA employees have participated in a massive deception for more than 35 years. At the peak of the Apollo program, NASA employed 400,000 people.
It was a giant step for mankind. We moved from people dreaming about whether people could get into space, and we went ahead in a very short time. So it was a very momentous achievement.
On July 16, 1969, the Apollo 11 astronauts prepared for liftoff. But while the world eagerly awaited for history to be made, one man already had his doubts. Through the early 1960s, Bill Casing worked in the technical publications department for Rocketdyne, a company that helped manufacture the Apollo rockets. Though not an engineer, Casing questioned the competence of the Apollo project. He claims the CIA has tried to silence him by making 3 attempts on his life. Today, he lives a quiet life in the Nevada desert, running a cat sanctuary.
I really believe that they weren't in the command capsule at launch. They did a little bit of a magician act with the astronauts. They went up the elevator, but they came down the elevator. In other words, they did not want to risk the lives of the astronauts in case the Saturn blew up.
Like Bill Casing, self-trained engineer and author Ralph Renee questions NASA's engineering capability at the time of the launches.
There is absolutely no way they went to the moon with what they had. In fact, there's no way they can go today. There's no way they can go tomorrow. You don't send man where you haven't sent the monkey.
But if NASA didn't put a man on the moon, it would have had to fake the evidence. In fact, it's NASA's own visual images that have done the most to fuel conspiracy theories. Marcus Allen is the British publisher of Nexus, a magazine of alternative politics, history, and science.
Those photographs can be demonstrated not to have been taken on the lunar surface. Now, if they were not taken on the lunar surface, there's only one other place they could have been taken, and that's on Earth.
Conspiracy theorists believe all 6 of the Apollo moon landings were hoaxes and point to these NASA photographs as proof. For example, they claim that areas lit from behind should be in dark shade, when in fact they reveal full detail. In others, the shadows are at near right angles. Is this because they were lit by separate light sources? None of the Apollo photographs reveal any traces of stars, despite being taken in space. When archived film footage is sped up, the astronauts appear to be running at normal speed in Earth gravity. And why does the flag seem to flutter in a breeze when there's no wind on the moon? To test these conspiracy claims, we relied on our own technical knowledge as filmmakers to create a lunar set. We chose the Trona Pinnacles, a desert area 4 hours from Hollywood, the home of movie making. Our moon set will be used as a backdrop, not to fake our own lunar landings, but to challenge the hoax theories. And though we can't duplicate the intensity of the sun here in the night desert, our single studio light is powerful enough for our experiments. By testing some of the most famous conspiracy arguments, can we put the lunar fraud theories to rest once and for all? Conspiracy moon landing will continue in a moment. National Geographic Channel Presents now continues. In 1969, the public had little reason to question mankind's historic first step on the moon. After all, the achievement was a celebration of technological supremacy. America had finally won the space race. While millions celebrated the historic mission, Ian Morrison was a student at the Jodrell Bank Radio Telescope near Manchester, England. There, he witnessed the event from a unique perspective. The telescope's radio tracking device allowed him to listen in to the astronauts' conversations. It also meant he could follow the Eagle as it prepared to land on the lunar surface.
I should say that we were not officially tracking the Apollo craft. We were doing this for fun, our own fun and our own interest.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start.
We could hear the whole conversation of the astronauts all the way down to the surface. They were obviously highly excited, and it must have been wonderful as they sort of literally reached the surface.
2, 1, 0. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Astronomer Sir Patrick Moore reported the mission live on British television.
Ever since the dawn of human history, we dreamed about going to other worlds, and this was the first time it had been done. And of course it was an exciting time, and also a very tense one.
Conspiracy theorists claim NASA faced an uphill struggle with its 1960s technology. Just 14 months before the Apollo 11 mission, Neil Armstrong test-piloted a lunar lander research vehicle. The result wasn't typical, but it provided fodder for the skeptics.
Unfortunately, it went out of his control, and luckily he was able to eject before it crashed in flames. And of course the point is, if they couldn't get a simulator to work on Earth, how in the world could they get the actual lunar module to work on the moon?
Conspiracy theorists question not only the technical capabilities of the landing craft, but also the computing power that guided it. They compare the computer technology on board the Apollo spacecraft to that of a pocket calculator. Jim Oberg is a former space shuttle engineer hired by NASA to write a book disproving the conspiracy claims. When NASA dropped the book, Jim continued with his own defense of the Apollo project.
It's pretty amazing to realize there's probably more computer technology here in an automobile than in the Apollo spacecraft.
But as Jim points out, it's not the technology you have that counts, it's how you use it.
The Apollo computers, spacecraft computers in those days, spoke pretty much numeric language.
Unlike modern-day PCs, the Apollo computers didn't have to store files or process images. Most of the number crunching was done at mission control, and the information transmitted back to the astronauts.
But it was still a very simple computer, and yet the exact tasks needed were well defined and well understood. The computer couldn't do a whole lot more, but it was able to do enough for Apollo.
At Jodrell Bank, Ian Morrison tracked the crucial last minutes of the computer-guided Eagle as it faced its greatest challenge, landing on the moon.
We had some equipment here that could literally measure the acceleration or deacceleration of the spacecraft as it slowed down towards the surface. And it's shown here graphically, and this is literally just a copy of the original graph that we have. And what you see here is a very nice smooth curve. The fact it's becoming more gentle means that the spacecraft was gently coming down to land under computer control.
60 seconds. Lights on.
But the interesting thing is that just before it looked as though it was going to land, the graph changed, and instead of going down, the craft accelerated upwards.
As we were at 500 feet and Neil Armstrong took over the controls manually to redirect it, because he could see that we were headed for a place that didn't look too suitable, and he wanted to fly over it on the other side.
Roger, 1201 alarm. Roger, we got you. We're going at alarm.
Neil Armstrong realized the automatic pilot was taking them down into a boulder-filled crater.
He lifted the LEM up, and you can see this quite little bump here as he accelerated up from the surface. And then you see this rather wiggly bit as he basically flew over the surface beyond the crater and finally brought the LEM to land.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
And then Neil's voice came through, the Eagle has landed. And that for me was a minute of intense relief. And since I'm on the air live, I had to watch what I said.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mankind's first steps on the moon have become the epicenter of hoax theories. In their attempt to disprove the missions, conspiracy theorists analyze the footage frame by frame. One of the most famous pieces of footage in history is Buzz Aldrin's dance across the moonscape.
Near the end of the 2.5 hours, in front of the television camera, I did have an opportunity to prance around and hop and demonstrate different methods of moving around. The movement, because of the restrictions of the spacesuit, was basically like being in slow motion.
But conspiracy theorists claim this footage was actually filmed in a studio and broadcast at half speed. When sped up, the astronauts appear to be running in Earth gravity. Back on our moon set, our astronaut is wearing an accurate replica of an Apollo 11 suit. If the conspiracy theorists are correct, we should be able to reproduce the look of lunar gravity by slowing him down. At half speed, our astronaut's awkward leaps vaguely resemble those of a moonwalker. but he's not able to duplicate the lightness of Buzz Aldrin's bouncing step. NASA faced its own challenges trying to prepare the astronauts for life in space.
Well, there were a lot of different schemes of suspending a person and taking up 1/6 of his weight by pulleys or working on a sort of a slanted platform.
Another of NASA's favorite methods was parabolic flight, or as the astronauts called it, the vomit comet. By climbing and diving in a series of arcs, an airplane can simulate reduced gravity for 30 seconds at a time. These sessions served as road tests for the spacesuits. If, as the conspiracy theorists claim, NASA faked the Apollo missions, then it also had to fake the photographic evidence.
I do not think it was feasible for the astronauts to take the wonderful pictures that NASA has presented as having been taken on the moon. There are so many impediments that were natural. The fact that they wore gloves that couldn't be manipulated, the fact that they didn't have any sources of light, any flash.
Ralph Renee believes the design of the Apollo spacesuits would have prevented astronauts from taking photographs on the moon. He has designed a space glove machine to replicate the effects of space on the body.
In the near vacuum of space, the gases within his body would immediately expand.
And what I do is I pull a vacuum in this chamber I created, and I have a glove inserted inside of it. And it was to prove that the flexibility they shown in their suits and gloves are impossible. Right now, I can put my hand in there and I can move it every which way. I can grasp, I make a fist, I can lift up, down. But as soon as I throw this switch here, I evacuate the chamber.
As air is sucked out of the machine, the vacuum makes it more and more difficult to move the glove.
And this glove doesn't want to move. I can't bend it backwards. I can hardly force it down, and I can make a fist, but you can't hold it. And you could never pick, I mean, how could you pick up small screws and bolts like they've shown them to do, or trigger a little tiny trigger on a camera with the glove doing this?
Coming up, lunar shadows and a flapping flag. Is it proof of conspiracy? Welcome back to Conspiracy Moon Landing. Trained aerospace engineer Jay Windley runs a website dedicated to refuting the moon landing conspiracies. He's so passionate about the subject, he has become devoted to challenging even the most persistent theories.
This is a Hasselblad EL500 camera manufactured specially for the lunar missions. It attached to the spacesuit via this bayonet. The camera would have a framework surrounding the bottom and rear of the camera, and it would slide down onto the control unit here so that the astronaut could work with his hands without worrying about the camera.
Lunar cameras didn't have a viewfinder because the astronauts' helmets prevented them from looking down and framing the shot.
Basically, you could just sort of point that camera at what you wanted without having to really look through a viewfinder.
But according to conspiracy theorists, this was a problem that couldn't be solved.
This is where the shutter is on the Hasselblad camera, which cannot be seen from inside the helmet the astronauts are wearing. So how do they know they've taken a photograph? How do they know the fingers even got onto the shutter? How do they know they pressed it?
The shutter release, normally a very small button, has been made especially large so that it can be pressed with an astronaut's glove.
Along with pressurized inner suits, there were other design features to help astronauts operate the camera.
The focus ring has been fitted with stops that correspond to near, medium, far, and infinity. So he didn't have to pay attention to whether he was 8 feet or 9 feet away from a subject. He wouldn't have to very carefully measure it.
Richard Underwood was responsible for teaching Apollo astronauts the art of lunar photography.
Even in the early days, before they went to the moon, I'd say, you know, when you get back from this journey, you will be a national hero. But your photographs, I say, if they're good, they'll live forever. I tell them your only key to immortality is the quality of your photography. Nothing else. Forget all the other stuff.
The astronauts were told to take their lunar cameras everywhere they went and practice.
They took them home to photograph their friends and family and barbecues and sporting events and all other types of things. They knew that camera very, very effectively.
So all of the crew members understood pretty well how to operate this, and the film turned out to be very, very versatile in coming up with just outstanding results.
Ironically, these outstanding results led to one of the most famous photographic anomalies, the strange case of the lunar shadows.
Since the sun was the only source of light, all shadows on the moon should be exactly parallel, but they aren't.
Because the lunar shadows fall in different directions, conspiracy theorists maintain they were created by separate artificial light sources.
There's only one sun. There are not two. But these shadows are anomalous in that sometimes they are diverging from objects and sometimes converging. And it can't be. You can go any place on this planet when the sun's up and you look at two objects and those sun shadows are parallel.
But if we take up Ralph Renee's challenge, we find that shadows aren't always parallel.
Shadows are a very poor way of determining the direction of the light source because they tend to diverge and converge based on the shape of the object that casts them, and also because of the terrain that lies underneath them. These affect the direction of shadows as we see them.
Skeptics also question the amount of detail visible in areas that should be in shade. Their explanation? A second light source has filled them in.
Well, let's have a look at one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century, Man on the Moon. It was taken by Neil Armstrong of Buzz Aldrin on Apollo 11. Given that it's very harsh light, as you can see here, where it strikes directly, you would expect the shadow area to be virtually invisible, but it's not.
But on our man-made lunar set, we can clearly see the reflective properties created by our only source of light.
As you can see, there is only one light source in this entire picture, and it's behind us. According to the conspiracy theorists, this side of the astronaut should be in total shadow. But it isn't. What's happening? The light from the ground around us is being reflected back up toward the astronaut, and it's illuminating this portion of him.
Another cause for suspicion among conspiracy theorists is the Apollo mission's American flag.
Wherever there's an American flag, it's always brilliantly lit up, even if it's on the shadow side. And on the shadow side, that should be really dark black. But they had little spotlights, obviously, because that's the only way you can do it.
Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent?
Conspiracy theorists say that it's suspicious for the flag to be brightly lit on both sides in all of the photographs. They say it should appear in shadow at some point. Here we can see our flag brightly lit from the front, but if we move around to the back, we can see that even with our single light source, it's still brightly lit. The light is shining through and making the flag glow.
But what about the issue of the flag waving in an environment with no wind?
When they were filming some of the flag scenes, they had air conditioners going to keep the astronauts cooler since they were wearing their little space suits. So it's very possible that what we saw was wind.
Is this waving flag the ultimate proof the landings were faked in the studio? On our moon set, Jay Windley plans to prove otherwise. The planting of the Apollo flag has given conspiracy theorists what they believe is their trump card.
What I see is a flutter which is caused by variable wind pressures. So the picture could not have been taken on the moon no matter what the apologists say. Either that or the moon has a breeze.
Despite all their preparations on Earth, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin didn't know what to expect as they got ready to plant the flag.
Putting the flag on the moon was really a symbolic highlight of the mission. It was one that we had not really rehearsed. Neil knew where the flag was stowed. We brought it out, then we had to put the two pieces together.
It won't go out. Leave that in.
The astronauts had to drive the flagstaff into the hard lunar surface with a twisting motion. A horizontal aluminum rod kept the flag suspended.
And this caused the free end of the flag to flip up and back in response to that. Also, this is an aluminum tube, very similar to the ones used on the Apollo mission. It's very springy. If I cause it to spring and then let go of it, we see that this motion continues long after I've let go of it.
On Earth, air resistance dampens this pendulum motion. But on the lunar surface, there's no air to slow the flag and stop it from waving.
Most obvious evidence the flag was on the moon and not in any air is that whenever people walked by it, it didn't move at all. It only moved when someone was working with the staff or letting go as it rocked back and forth.
Conspiracy theorists point to another strange anomaly, one that can't be explained by lack of atmosphere. As the 16-ton landing craft touched down, its rockets should have blasted away the top layer of dust, exposing the rocky lunar surface. But clearly, footprints are visible beneath the spacecraft, and there seems to be no dust on the landing pads.
This enormously powerful jet of flame and heat and gas, it would have easily scooped up an enormous crater. In fact, there was supposition that the crater would have been so big that the lunar lander would have disappeared into it. That's true.
Ralph Renee has devised an experiment to illustrate his claim that the rocket-powered lander should have left a crater. By his calculations, the lunar module's rocket is 26 times more powerful than a garden leaf blower. And if this can leave a crater in a gravel pit, then so should a spacecraft with 10,000 pounds of thrust.
They didn't move dry dust, they didn't move little rocks, they didn't move anything. So the demonstration is to show that this stuff will disappear immediately, and I'll even be able to gouge some kind of a hole. Here we go.
If Renee is correct, the lunar surface, like the gravel pit, would show visible signs of disturbance.
When it actually landed, the dust was all still there. Now, how can that be? You know, if you blow dust away, it goes away, like I just did here. I swept the ground.
But on approach, the Eagle had reduced its power to 25%. As it glided into land, the gentle forward motion further lessened the thruster's impact on the lunar surface. And a closer inspection of some of the photos reveals that the landing did, in fact, disturb a very fine layer of dust, but not enough to cover the landing pads. But dust is not the only element missing from the photographic evidence. We'll continue with more National Geographic Channel Presents after this. And now, back to National Geographic Channel Presents. With no weather on the moon, one would expect a spectacular view of space. Yet there are no stars in the Apollo photographs.
Back then, fortunately for me and us who are trying to break this thing out, the truth, they took no pictures of the stars.
Bill Casing is convinced this was a conscious decision on NASA's part.
Astronomers could have easily discerned that the star positions were not those that would have appeared in a photograph taken from the moon. So it's another case where they could not fake it, so they simply ignored it. If you were to talk to Aldrin or Armstrong or any of the other Apollo astronauts, they would actually not respond in any way to questions regarding stars.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon.
by eye without looking through the optics.
I asked Neil Armstrong whether he saw stars because I knew everybody else would ask it. I knew the answer, of course. The point is that the eyes aren't adapted to that.
The human eye reacts to light by opening and closing the iris. In bright light, the iris becomes smaller. In the dark, it widens. On the moon, the eye, like the camera aperture, can't adjust to the brightness of the lunar surface and the darkness of space at the same time.
If you were to stand in a floodlit stadium or under a streetlight in a city, you would have the same effect. If you looked up, you wouldn't see many stars at all.
Even our own television camera can't adjust to the extreme contrast. On our moon set, Jay Windley plans an experiment in the hopes of disproving one of the conspiracy theorists' key arguments.
We're going to find out that if we use an identical camera loaded with identical film and we shoot pictures of the night sky, we won't get stars.
Will Jay's experiment be enough to invalidate the conspiracy theorists' arguments? The morning after the shoot, the negatives are developed at a professional processing laboratory in Los Angeles.
In our experiment in the desert, we shot a variety of photographs using different film formats. In this 35mm photograph, we see that the shadows of the crew members in our single light source very distinctly converge together. In fact, there's almost a 90-degree difference in the apparent shadow direction. In this photograph here, we see the effects of terrain on the shadows. The hills change the apparent direction of shadows. The astronaut's shadow here falls in one direction. The shadow of the crew falls in yet another direction because of the hill.
These results directly contradict the conspiracy claims.
Like the Apollo astronauts, we had to guess at our focusing distances and our exposure settings. And because we had no viewfinder, we had to guess at the direction the camera was pointing. And you can clearly see that even with those handicaps, we were able to take quite usable photographs. You can immediately see that there are no stars in this photograph, even though the stars were very bright during our experiment. They're simply too dim to be registered on film at the exposure levels that we used to take these photographs.
The results of our photographic experiment appear to be overwhelming. But the mysterious image of this rock in an Apollo 16 photograph seems to back up conspiracy claims that all the moon landings were faked.
It's a rock that obviously was made out of paper mache, and very clearly on the rock is the letter C.
In Ralph Renee's mind, the C rock should be called the C prop.
Somebody told me that in Hollywood when they do a set, the set manager comes around and drops cards on the ground, and it says A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, or 1 to 10 or whatever, and the prop men, whatever you call these people, they come out and they put that particular prop over the card. But in Hollywood, they're smart enough to turn the thing upside down so you can't see the mark on the prop.
NASA explains that this photo was a misprint. The letter C is nothing more than a hair on the negative. But this explanation doesn't satisfy magazine publisher Marcus Allen. He believes it's impossible that any of these photographs could survive a journey to the moon and back.
In an unprotected camera, in unprotected environment, and the films that were in photographs we have seen as a result of that, it demonstrate absolutely no radiation damage whatsoever.
In 1998, IMAX began production on a film about construction of the International Space Station.
They flew the cameras up in the space shuttle with their magazines attached, and the IMAX cameras take 70mm roll film. Incidentally, the same film as was used in the Hasselblad still cameras on Apollo. This film had to be protected, and it was carried up in lead-lined boxes.
According to conspiracy theorists, radiation was the final insurmountable obstacle. Not only would it destroy film, it would kill the astronauts. The Earth's magnetic field protects our planet from high doses of radiation. But beyond this zone, deep in space, is where conspiracy theorists believe astronauts would be vulnerable to radiation's deadly effects.
The moon is irradiated by the sun constantly with terrible heat, and of course there's cosmic radiation, and then there are micrometeorites that travel 60,000 miles an hour that would go right through the camera, the film, and of course the astronauts themselves.
After leaving the Earth's atmosphere, the astronauts rocketed through the Van Allen belts.
Van Allen, he said it was a sea of deadly radiation. You would pick up a death dose just about the time you got through the Van Allen shield. You'd be cooked and you'd be dying.
These radioactive belts form a thick ring encircling the equator, thinning out around the North and South poles.
Until they get an engine that'll lift the life capsule surrounded by 6 feet of water or equivalent mass of lead, they don't even dare go through the Van Allen shield.
In fact, Dr. Van Allen, who's still alive, makes no secret of the fact that he thinks these stories about killer radiation are silly. Entertaining but preposterous is his words. And the reason is that the radiation levels there are not enough to hurt you unless you stay there for a long time. Van Allen says about a month.
NASA claims the astronauts endured only a brief exposure, penetrating the thinnest section of the belts in 1 hour. But once they crossed through, they faced an even greater danger.
So here we have these clowns running around in tinfoil craft, stopping solar radiation. And I'm not talking about the light, I'm talking about the radiation from the solar storms.
You put a man in a powerful solar flare, he's dead. End of story. He is dead, unless he carries protection.
These eruptions from the sun can knock out satellites and electricity grids on Earth, but they can also be detected by an early warning computer system.
When you land on the moon, you're practically standing still being bombarded with all this solar radiation is smacking into you, which is why they had to hide the whole thing, because it just can't be done. It couldn't be done then, can't be done today, and it sure isn't going to be done in the future when they're planning on this manned mission to Mars.
Just 3 months after the Apollo 16 mission, NASA admitted that a violent solar flare hit the moon's surface, an eruption so powerful it could have killed the astronauts had they been there.
Solar flares are one of those things that you have to take a calculated risk on, because they will zap you with radiation once they get to you, but you've got a long time, hours if not a day or more, to either come back to Earth, find a shielded place, or prepare yourself.
Astronauts could only rely on their spaceship to survive a solar flare.
And they had plans for this. The plan was to turn the bulky end of the ship toward the incoming front of radiation. That bulk of the ship and all the fuel in it would provide plenty of protection for that burst of radiation.
For conspiracy theorists, radiation is the final nail in the coffin. They believe the astronauts could never have survived a trip to the moon and back. But it may also provide the key to unlocking secrets from the lunar surface itself. Can radiation supply the definitive answer to the question, did we really land on the moon? Stay tuned. More answers when we return. And now the conclusion of Conspiracy Moon Landing. In total, the Apollo missions brought back over 800 pounds of lunar soil and rock. These samples were distributed to laboratories all over the world. At the independent Berkeley Geochronology Center in California, geologist Paul Rene has been studying lunar rock samples for the last 10 years. His main interest is these tiny glass spherules from the moon's surface, created by the intense heat of a meteorite impact.
The spherules that we've been analyzing are tiny balls of glass, so they're like magma that we find on the Earth in that sense. But they've cooled very, very quickly, and so they form a essentially uniform glass sphere.
But unlike spherules found in Earth's solid volcanic lava, the moon's lack of terrestrial gravity results in spherules which are larger and more round.
In this copper disk, we have loaded 145 of these lunar spherules. This copper disk will then be loaded into a sample chamber, which you can see here.
Using a laser heating system to release gases locked inside the spherules, Paul Rene looks for evidence of cosmic radiation to uncover clues about their age and place of origin.
The lunar materials that we've analyzed and that others have analyzed show evidence of having been bombarded by cosmic radiation, which we don't see on Earth because we have an atmosphere that really shields them very effectively.
Rene has determined the spherules date back 3.9 billion years. This finding eliminates the possibility that they originated on Earth.
The oldest glass I'm aware of on the Earth, anywhere, is about 165 million years old. So the Earth, with its very dynamic environment, does not tend to preserve these glassy objects, whereas the Moon, being essentially dead from a thermal point of view, does tend to preserve these things. The results that we obtained are absolutely definitively proof of a lunar origin. I can say with utmost assurance that they were derived from the Moon.
But even this level of proof fails to shake the stubborn conviction of conspiracy theorists.
The lunar rocks were fake, just like the pictures were in the stories of the astronauts. NASA has a ceramics laboratory where it would have been very easy to produce the 800 pounds of rocks allegedly brought back from the Moon.
But it's evidence the astronauts left behind and not what they brought back that may offer the clinching proof. Every successful moon mission set up a range of experiments. More than 30 years after Apollo 11, one of them continues to operate, the Lunar Laser Ranger.
There were two major experiments. One was a series of corner reflectors to reflect laser beams from the Earth sent to the Moon that then, because of the geometry of these corner reflectors, would send the beam back in exactly the direction that it came from.
High up in the Davis Mountain Range, the McDonald Observatory in Texas continues to gather information from the experiment.
In 33 years, no one has showed up. No one has come and talked to us.
Jerry Wyatt would welcome a visit from the conspiracy theorists. Since 1969, his team has been firing a laser beam at the experiment an average of 240 times a year.
And of course, at Apollo 11 site is where the United States placed its first lunar retro package. So we fire laser at this spot and three others on the Moon. Now he's turned the laser on. In a few seconds you'll see the splash.
The laser hits the reflector on the Moon's surface and bounces back as a series of pulses invisible to the human eye. By measuring the time it takes for each laser pulse to return, scientists gather key information about the Earth's position in the solar system.
That's not light coming from the Moon. The splash you see is light coming from the end of our own telescope. That's the first spot where a man walked on the Moon.
Our search for the truth has revealed the definitive answer. Maybe that's why conspiracy theorists have so little to say on this subject.
And so it's sad that the detractors have never taken the time to ask the people who are actually involved. They just make up their mind that it's a hoax and never bother to ask us.
At the height of the space race, the Soviet Union and East Germany had the technology to listen in on the Apollo missions. And yet, conspiracy theorists ignore the eavesdropping power and silence of America's arch enemies.
Why don't they ask the Russians? The Russians were in direct competition with us, and if the Russians suspected in any way that we were faking anything, they'd have broadcast that all over the world.
Every time we go to a new frontier, further out, people will tell stories and other people will wrap them in myth.
Perhaps all great human achievements are destined to attract skepticism and controversy.
In a million years of human history, going to the moon, baying for the moon, wishing for the moon was a metaphor for the impossible. And suddenly people did it. But I think a large part of it is just cultural vandalism.
Cultural vandal. I like it. I think I'm going to get a sign for my car. I am a cultural vandal. That's a good one.
Like the urge to deface the Mona Lisa or to carve your initials into a statue, to carve your initials onto the face of the Apollo program is just an urge that people seem to have, some people.
Compared to all the effort it would take to create and hide a lie of such magnitude, it would have been far easier for NASA to build a rocket and put man on the moon.